It's Black History Month, and we are still celebrating Black excellence. This week, I am talking about one of my favorite activists and mathematicians, Bob Moses. His life and legacy made an indelible mark on America's civil rights movement and math education. Hi, I'm Gabrielle Burchak, and I have a background in math, science, and journalism. By the time you're done listening to this, you will know a lot more about an incredible individual who changed many lives. In the year 415, the infamous philosopher and mathematician Hypatia of Alexandria, Egypt, was savagely murdered by church monks. This murder shocked the Roman community and its government leaders. Hypatia was known far and wide as a respected philosopher, mathematician, government advisor, and a professor. Hypatia, The Sum of Her Life, is a book that I wrote that looks not just at the circumstances surrounding her death, but also at the sum of her entire life. I weave in the details of her education, disciples, Neoplatonic philosophies, female contemporaries, and the many mathematics that she wrote and taught about. There is truly more to Hypatia's life than her death. Hypatia, The Sum of Her Life, written by me, Gabrielle Burchak, is now on sale on Amazon. Buy your copy today. Today's podcast is about a person I've wanted to talk about for a long time. Robert Moses, also known as Bob Moses, realized that math literacy is an extension of the civil rights movement. Math is more than about understanding numbers, science, and data. It is a tool for helping kids learn a skill that empowers them in school, college, and life. I've always been inspired by Moses' story. And before I start, I want to give some context to this podcast. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, where I attended South High School. Yay! I was lucky to go there because it was out of my district. And what made the experience memorable was attending a school with great diversity. Our principal was Mr. Harold Scott, South's first Black high school principal. He often held school assemblies that taught us so much about Black America's rich history, including information about the civil rights movements in the 1960s. And I really consider myself truly fortunate that I received this education. So, after our assemblies, I would go to the library and find a couple of books that taught me more about the civil rights movement. So, I was 15 years old when I learned about Freedom Summer. It was also known as Mississippi Freedom Summer or the Freedom Summer Project. It was organized and launched by the Council of Federated Organizations, also known as the CFO, which was an alliance of 4 primary civil rights organizations. These organizations included the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as the SNCC, the Congress of Racial Equality, also known as CORE, the National Association for the Advancement of Color People, also known as the NAACP, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. Bob Moses was the field secretary of the SNCC and the co-director of the CFO and directed the Freedom Summer Project. And I will go more into this later, but for context, this is how I learned so much about Bob Moses, and I've been following his career ever since I was in high school in the 80s. I have always been inspired by his story, his tenacity, and his ability to organize and mobilize. Bob Moses was born on January 23, 1935, in Harlem, New York. His father, Gregory H. Moses, was a janitor, and his mom, Louise Paris Moses, stayed home to raise the kids in the Harlem River Houses, which was a public housing complex. In the projects, they had a small one-room library that would open once a week where his mom would go and gather a couple of books for him. So he was raised in a family that loved him and encouraged education. He grew up in a world where racial segregation and inequality were deeply embedded in American society. However, unlike many civil rights leaders of his time, Moses did not come from the South. Instead, he was shaped by the urban struggle of Black communities in New York. He attended Stuyvesant High School, one of the most prestigious public schools in the city. From there, he went to Hamilton College, where he studied philosophy and French. In 1957, he earned a master's degree in philosophy from Harvard University. He had started his work on his PhD, but his mother had passed away and his father had to be hospitalized. So in 1958, he returned to New York to help his parents. While in New York, he taught math at Horace Mann School in the Bronx and tutored math to private students. Moses' journey could have easily led him to a quiet life as an academic, but history had other plans. Inspired by the student sit-ins in the South, Moses decided to join the growing civil rights movement. In 1960, Bob Moses became involved with the SNCC, an organization led by young activists committed to direct action against segregation. Unlike some of the more prominent leaders of the movement, Moses was known for his quiet, strategic approach. In 1961, he went to Mississippi, one of the most dangerous places in the South for a Black activist. The state was notorious for its violent suppression of Black voting rights. Moses helped launch the Mississippi Voter Registration Project, which worked to empower African Americans to exercise their right to vote. His work was about registering voters and shifting the power dynamic. He saw voting as the key to breaking the cycle of oppression that kept Black communities in poverty and political invisibility. As I noted earlier, various organizations and civil rights groups led the Mississippi Voter Registration Project. It was created to empower Black citizens as they were kept from voting. At the time, the state governments would require Black and African Americans to take literacy tests, tax them at the polls, intimidate them, and worse yet, beat them. Mississippi was one of the most dangerous places for civil rights activism. White supremacist groups, local law enforcement, and state officials used threats, arrests, and violence to prevent Black voter registration. In the 1960s, Mississippi was one of the most dangerous places for civil rights activists, and it still is. In 2023, Mississippi presented a bill in the Senate introducing restrictions on protests around the state-owned buildings. Even though it's been 60 years since the civil rights movement, numerous states across the country have governments that implement a range of discriminatory practices and strive to disenfranchise Black voters and other marginalized communities. Some measures currently being implemented include strict voter ID laws, reduction of early voting periods, limitations on mail-in voting, and the purging of voter rolls. So, back to 1961. When Moses went to Mississippi, he faced beatings, arrests, and constant threats to his life. His resilience and fortitude are extraordinary. While he was in Mississippi, white segregationists, including the police, were horribly violent towards the entire organization, including Moses. Once, when he was riding through Greenwood, Mississippi, Klansmen shot at the car. The driver was hit, but miraculously survived. Nevertheless, Moses brought the car to a stop and held the bleeding driver. Another time, when he was assisting two Black farmers during a voter registration drive and walking them up the steps of a courthouse, Moses was bashed in the head with a knife handle by the cousin of the sheriff. He was bleeding extensively but kept going up the steps. Only after he helped them register did he reach out for medical help. There wasn't a Black doctor in this specific county, so he had to be driven to another town where he received 9 stitches in his head. I know this is a podcast about math and science, but still, this story is important because equality for marginalized communities is essential. Moses worked so hard in these areas to make sure that Black and African Americans received their right to vote. Sadly, one of the most tragic moments of this period was the murder of 3 civil rights workers that included James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. The Ku Klux Klan brutally killed them. This act of terror only reinforced Moses' belief that the fight for equality needed to be waged on multiple fronts. By the mid-1960s, his work contributed to the eventual passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discriminatory practices like literacy tests and poll taxes. But after years of activism, Moses withdrew from public life. He recognized that others who followed his example were getting killed, and this weighed heavily on him. So, he sought refuge from the trauma and intensity of the movement. In 1966, Moses received a draft notification. He was 31 years old. The cutoff age for being drafted was 26, which meant he was 6 years older than the required age. He was suspicious of this draft notice and believed that it was the action of government agents. As a result, he moved to Canada, where he stayed for a while. Then he moved to Tanzania, Africa, with his wife, where he worked as a math teacher for the Ministry of Education. He remained in Tanzania until 1976 and then returned to the U.S., eventually landing in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In the 1980s, while helping his daughter with her math homework, he realized she was struggling with the topic. That's when he had an epiphany. Math literacy was just as crucial as voting rights had been in the 1960s. In an interview with NPR, he is quoted as saying, "Education is still basically Jim Crow as far as the kids who are in the bottom economic strata of the country." He went on, explaining that no one knows about them, no one cares about them. And unfortunately, he is correct. And this was made evident, especially during COVID, when a lot of students who were in the bottom economic strata of the country didn't even attend classes. In 1982, Moses received a fellowship with the MacArthur Foundation. This fellowship spurred him to start the Algebra Project, a groundbreaking initiative to make math accessible to students in underserved communities. The project aimed to provide quality education as a constitutional right for all students. He saw math education as a new civil rights issue, which was, if Black and low-income students were not given the tools to succeed in math, they would be locked out of future economic opportunities, particularly in STEM fields. In 2002, the project received financial support from the National Science Foundation. Upon receiving this support, the project created a benchmark for students who were in the bottom quartile. This benchmark was that they graduated high school on time and were prepared to do the college math required to graduate. This approach is unique. In a 1996 article in Smithsonian Magazine, the author, Bruce Watson, writes, quote, "The program begins with gumdrops and toothpicks used to make geometric constructs. It moves on into subway trips, with the stops becoming positive and negative numbers, then into narratives of the same trips and identification of various points of interest. These then are assigned symbols. Students get involved, dealing with both abstractions and practical logic, at first learning ratios by mixing lemonade, 1 part sugar, 3 parts lemon juice. It sounds simple-minded, but it works. In schools that use the Algebra Project, a far higher number of students go on to high school algebra than they ever did before, and they do well." Unquote. Moses developed a unique approach to teaching algebra, using real-world experience to help students grasp mathematical concepts. He was able to turn math into action and make it engaging and approachable, which, in turn, made it accessible to a multitude of students who benefit from it. The Algebra Project is still in operation today, and it continues to have such an incredible influence. The Algebra Project is based on 3 principles that include 1. Site development. That's the work that the Algebra Project does with the schools. 2. Research. That's the research they conduct to implement math literacy. And 3. Professional development. And that's the training they provide to teachers to help make math approachable. The Algebra Project isn't only about math, it's about empowerment. Moses believed that just as literacy had been necessary for full citizenship in the 20th century, math literacy was essential in the 21st century. Without it, entire communities would be shut out of economic and technological advancements. The project now includes schools across the country, reaching thousands of students. It also inspires initiatives like the Young People's Project, where high school students and college students become math tutors and mentors for younger students. To learn more about the Algebra Project, please visit them at algebra.org. Moses' vision went beyond traditional education reform. He argued that the problem wasn't with the students. It was with the system that failed to equip them with the skills that they needed to succeed. His work challenged schools to rethink how they taught math, making it more relevant and engaging for students from all backgrounds. Bob Moses continued his work with the Algebra Project well into the 2000s, advocating for educational reform and equity in math education. Even as he aged, he remained deeply engaged in the fight for justice. He recognized that literacy, specifically in math, would not be given. Instead, proper education would be a challenge for the Black communities to obtain, much like it was a challenge to obtain voting rights during the Civil Rights Movement. On July 25, 2021, Robert Parris Moses passed away at the age of 86. His death was a significant loss, but his legacy lives on in the thousands of students, educators, and activists he inspired. And oh, how he inspired. Robert Parris Moses was a man of quiet determination. He was a strategist who believed in grassroots empowerment. Whether fighting for voting rights in Mississippi or math literacy in classrooms, he never sought the spotlight. Instead, he simply did the work. His life teaches us that civil rights are not only about politics, but also about access to opportunity in all forms. Education, like voting, is a pathway to power. Moses made it his mission to ensure that the next generation had a seat at the table. No doubt, Moses showed us that the fight for justice isn't just in the courtrooms or the streets. It's also in the classrooms. Until next time, carpe diem. Thank you for joining me at Math Science History. Please remember to subscribe to the show. Also, if you could leave a rating or a review, I would truly appreciate that. Those ratings and reviews really help to increase my listenership, which help me get more sponsors and advertisers, which help me keep the podcast up and running. If you want to learn more about the history of math and science, please visit me at mathsciencehistory.com. There you can find the transcripts and additional information to each topic, as well as additional links to other sites. Oh, and hey, if you like what you're listening to, and you like what you're reading, please feel free to click on that cup of coffee and make a donation to the podcast, because every cup of coffee that you buy helps me to pay for the expenses that go into making this podcast. If you would like an early peek and listen to the podcast, you can follow me on Patreon, where you can choose a tier or even pick your own price. Or you can also subscribe to Math Science History on Medium, where you can read an early release of the podcast, which includes the math. Also, if you're interested in having me speak at your school or your event, please visit me at GabrielleBurchak.com. I would love to come share the world of math, science, and history with you, your audience, and your students. Finally, if you're interested in leaving me a comment or submitting a podcast topic, you can always find me and Math Science History on your preferred platforms, including Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, or you can just search the Googly for Gabrielle Burchak. Until next time, carpe diem.